Our text for this morning's message is from Genesis 18, verses 1 through 15. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I be fruitful?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Yes, you did laugh." May God bless the reading of the word. Shortly after our graduation from seminary in Berkeley in 1977, Rhonda and I and our baby daughter loaded our possessions into a Ryder truck and a little blue Toyota station wagon, and we began the long journey from the San Francisco Bay Area to western Colorado. And a classmate from Grand Junction joined our caravan and served as our native guide. And that was my first experience crossing the vast and lonely desert spaces in the western United States. One day, as we stopped for a brief rest by the side of the road somewhere in Utah or Nevada, I looked around at the miles and miles of nothing and nowhere stretching off in all directions. There were no gas stations or other services in sight. And being the city boy that I am, I asked our friend, I said, "Harold, what happens if your car breaks down out here?" And he said, "You just have to depend on Western hospitality." Up to that point in my life, I had thought of hospitality as a nice thing, but optional. It was like a friendly invitation to dinner some evening when we were all free, perhaps. But our friend's remark that day in the desert cast new light on the essential and often life-saving nature that hospitality might have. Our text this morning tells of Abraham's extravagant hospitality shown to 3 mysterious guests who showed up at his campsite one hot, sunny day. Travelers depended on Middle Eastern hospitality, and those who hosted them relied on the travelers for news of the outside world. And so in verses 1 and 2 we read, "The Lord appeared to Abram by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed to the ground." The biblical writer lets us in on a secret. The Lord was present in this visit to Abraham and Sarah. But it does not sound as though Abraham knew that secret at first. The text purposely moves back and forth between speaking of 3 strangers in one moment and then identifying the presence of the Lord in their visit to Abraham in the next. Some Christians have seen fit to identify the Trinity in this story, but I don't think that we have to go that far to recognize that God's voice often comes from the mouth of a friend or a teacher or even a stranger. We are invited to discern the presence of a holy God in our day-to-day encounters with others. So there in the heat of the day, in the middle of a dry and lonely place, Abraham fulfills his sacred duty to extend life-giving hospitality to those who show up at his door. He urges them to stop and rest for a while. "Cool your tired, dusty feet," he urges, "and I will get you a snack to refresh you." Of course, the Hebrew doesn't say snack, but rather a morsel of bread is what it literally says. These strangers accept his offer to stop and to rest. And then quickly Abraham puts together not a mere snack, but a feast, meat and bread and curds and milk. And then he stands by like a waiter as his guests eat. It was probably this scene from the Old Testament that the author of the New Testament book of Hebrews was thinking of when he wrote in Hebrews 13, verse 2, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it." At its core, hospitality is about widening our circles of belonging. Abraham modestly offered rest and a little food, but what he did instead was to show extravagant hospitality as he included these unexpected strangers in his circle of belonging that day. Contrast this scene from Genesis chapter 18 with the very ugly tale of Sodom in the next chapter. Here, Abraham extends extreme hospitality openly in the light and heat of the noonday sun. His circle of belonging is generous enough to include these 3 strangers who showed up at his campsite unannounced. However, in the next chapter, we read of Lot and the visitors locked behind closed doors in the dark of the night. And we read the story of an angry mob beating on the door, attempting violence against the visitors and Lot's family, and the violation of hospitality. The circle of belonging for the residents of Sodom had become constricted and exclusive. A classic example of us versus them, and that was the sin of Sodom. The call to show hospitality is fundamentally about extending our circles of belonging. Who is worthy of our attention? Whose life matters to us? In a polarized time such as ours, there is less and less overlap of our circles of belonging. Do we regard those not within our circles as objects to be used or obstacles in our way to be brushed aside? I remember in the 1960s and early 70s, many young people would say, "Don't trust anyone over 30. Some of you remember that. If you were over 30 years old, you were not going to be included in the circle of belonging and care. In their research on the Holocaust, Samuel and Pearl Oliner explored why some people risked their lives to rescue their Jewish neighbors from Nazi violence during World War II, while others merely stood by and watched. In some countries, such as Italy, where people were intermarried, the hateful policies did not easily gain a foothold because people there knew each other. But in countries like Poland, on the other hand, where people were segregated and many Gentiles did not know any Jews, it was easier for hatred to take root and to work its violence. Well, that was not so long ago and not so far away. In every generation, life challenges us anew with the question, how wide is your circle of belonging? Who matters to us? Who is someone like me, someone deserving of my respect and my care? When I was in 7th grade, my grandpa Cushman passed away. And on Sunday morning of the week that he died, our family showed up at the church where my father was pastor, and a member of our church, a lady in her early 90s, greeted us and kindly extended her condolences. "I'm sorry to hear of your loss." "How old was Mr. Cushman?" she asked. "He was 72 years old," my mother explained. "Oh, just a young man," that lady explained. I was only 12 years old at the time and thought that was a strange response. How could anyone think that 72 years old was young, I wondered. Well, it's been a long time now since I was 12 years old. I turned 72 myself this year. And I understand what that lady at First Baptist Church of Willows, California was telling us. My circle of belonging has grown over the years and has become more inclusive rather than less. Our story this morning is about two aged people, Sarah and Abraham, who are informed that in a year they will become parents. Ridiculous. We and the writer know that such things do not happen. Sarah was well past her childbearing years. Listen again to verses 11 and 12. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I be fruitful?" Sarah and Abraham were unlikely choices for God to include in God's great circle of belonging and blessing. They were not in the prime of their lives by human standards, and some would have thought them to be past any usefulness in God's plan to bless the whole earth. But God included them. God extended hospitality to them. God chose them to play a role in widening the circle of belonging to humanity. So just as Abraham welcomed the visitors to his home and extended extravagant hospitality to them, including them in his circle of belonging, so too God includes the unlikely Sarah and Abraham. God chose to trust these people who were well over 30 years old. Terry Thomas Primer writes about her experience leading a ladies' Bible study one day on this story from Genesis 18. So she said, "Was Sarah's laughter a giggle of nervousness, a guffaw of incredulity, a chuckle of delight, or perhaps a snort of impossibility? I wonder," she wrote. "Some months ago," she said, "I told this story to a group of residents gathered for chapel in a nursing home in which the average age is 90. When I finished reading the Bible story, I asked the women there, "Would you like to be pregnant?" "You should have heard the giggles," she said. The women all looked at themselves and then at one another, and in their faces you could see memories of pregnancy, childbirth, and 2-year-olds running wild. And then as they looked at themselves in wheelchairs and with walkers, they laughed deep-throated chuckles of relief. Not a single one of them volunteered to become a mother again. The biblical writer tells us that when Sarah heard the visitors tell her husband that they would have a child within a year, she laughed. But why did Sarah laugh? Was it because the very idea was ridiculous? Or was she perhaps laughing at God's outrageous sense of humor? Or was it at least partially a laughter of joy at being included in God's circle of belonging, of love and care at her late stage in life? Sarah and Abraham were challenged with the wonder of an impossible promise. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. That question is put before people of faith at each stage of life. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? The New International Version renders that question this way: is anything too hard for the Lord? And this is the question that is posed to Christ's church in each new age. Is anything too hard for the Lord? One of my favorite Old Testament scholars is Walter Brueggemann, and he has commented on this passage with these words. He says, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" That is the question around which this confrontation revolves. It is an open question, one that waits for an answer. It is the question which surfaces everywhere in the Bible. We must say it is the fundamental question every human person must answer, and how it is answered determines everything else. Well, who is included in our circle of belonging? Who is worthy of our hospitality? If we look up, as Abraham did that day, are there strangers nearby waiting to be welcomed with our extravagant hospitality? Are there neighbors who need to be welcomed into our circles of belonging? Could God call us to be a source of new life for our part of the world? Could God call us, as God called Sarah and Abraham, to be part of God's plan to welcome the unlikeliest people into God's circle of blessing? We may laugh as Sarah laughed at the thought of God using us in some new, unexpected way. But from the pages of Scripture, let us hear the question: is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Amen.